Hello, this is Christian of Canto 1408, and recently me and my friend Bill Burns did an entire retrospective on the original Godzilla. Then we did a retrospective on all the Godzilla sequels in the Showa era of Godzilla. Now what we're doing a retrospective on all the Godzilla films of the Heisei era. So, I'm once again joined by college professor and author William Burns.
Hello, everyone.
Now, in order to fully explain the Heisei Godzilla films, we should probably start at the beginning of the series. In the early 1950s, producer Tomoki Tanaka conceived the idea of a giant monster film inspired by King Kong and the 1953 American monster film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Now, Toho hired Ashiro Honda to direct the film. Honda was actually a protege of legendary filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, who has directed many films for Toho. Honda was actually a soldier in the Japanese army during World War II, but after seeing what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he became a pacifist and became very, very anti-war. And honestly, I think Honda really is the reason why the original Godzilla is as good as it is, because I have a feeling Tomoki Tanaka just kind of wanted to make a generic monster film, but Honda, inspired by the real-life tragedies of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the infamous Lucky Dragon 5 incident, actually wanted to use the concept of a giant monster to make a political statement about the usage of nuclear weapons. So, as a result, the original Godzilla really does play out more like a film about nuclear war. It just uses a giant monster as a stand-in for the atomic bomb. Now, the original Godzilla was a huge success in Japan, and in 1956 the film was re-edited and released in America under the title Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now, the American cut of the film featured new scenes which were not in the original version that featured a character named Steve Martin played by Raymond Burr. Now, with the original film's success in Japan, Toho ended up making a long-running series of sequels, which started in 1955 with the film Godzilla Raids Again and ended in 1975 with the film Terror of Mechagodzilla. Now, as the sequels went on, they lost the original political and social commentary that the first movie was going for, and they started to become more like your generic B-movies, but as the series went on, they became more like kids' films, and Godzilla went from being a terrifying metaphor for nuclear war and became an outright superhero by the Godzilla films of the 1970s, where he was fighting different monsters, and the series very much became a series for children by the 1970s. Now, these first 15 Godzilla films are now referred to as the Showa Godzilla films because they all came out during the Showa period of Japan. Now, me and Bill already did an entire retrospective on the Showa Godzilla films. And I think we're both in agreement that gearing the series more towards children was probably the wrong decision to make. At the same time, we both agree that the 70s Godzilla films are actually really fun movies, and I would even say are good movies in their own right. They're just not good if you compare them to how dark the original Godzilla film was. Now, before we get on to each film individually, what is the Heisei Godzilla series to you? How do you feel about this series of Godzilla films as a whole?
I enjoyed them immensely. I think they're really, really well-made films. For the most part, I think they have a good balance of the entertainment value that you saw in, let's say, the 70s Godzilla movies, but with some interesting ideas that you got from the 60s movies as well. Some that works out more so in some films than others in the series, but for the most part, I thought this is the series itself has a very high level of quality.
Okay. I'm of two minds of the Heisei films. I love them. At the same time, I feel like there are some Godzilla fans who kind of overpraise the later Heisei Godzilla films. I think the first two are excellent, but I feel like by the time you got to the third one, they kind of fell into the same trap as the Showa films. They eventually got goofy again, I think. And I still like them, don't get me wrong, but I feel like there's almost an uneven balance of goofiness and taking itself very seriously, which I don't mind a Godzilla film that takes itself seriously. At the same time, with some of the goofy shit that was in the later Heisei films, I feel like they were taking themselves too seriously to a certain extent, but I still really enjoy them. There's only one in the series that I don't particularly enjoy, but we'll get to that when we talk about each individual film. But overall, it is a good series of Godzilla films. Now, the final Godzilla film, Terror of Mechagodzilla, ended up being a huge box office failure in Japan, but in the late 70s and early 80s, there were attempts by Toho to really sort of rejuvenate the franchise. Like, in 1977, there was apparently going to be a remake of the original Godzilla titled The Rebirth of Godzilla, but for some reason, this idea was scrapped. Now, I don't know how true this is, but apparently in the late 70s, they were also going to do a movie called Godzilla vs. the Devil, where Godzilla legitimately fights Satan. I don't know how true that actually is, but I'm not gonna lie. That actually would have been kind of awesome. But whether or not this was actually an idea going around at Toho at the time, they of course did scrap the idea. Now, Tanaka admitted that gearing the Godzilla films more towards children was a huge mistake, and inspired by 3 Mile Island, he wanted to gear the series more towards adults again, and return the series to its darker roots, and return the series to its anti-nuclear message. So, in 1984, you had the film The Return of Godzilla, which was a reboot of the Godzilla franchise, but also acted as a direct sequel to the original Godzilla, ignoring the continuity of all the Godzilla films that came in between, which I actually think, considering how goofy the Godzilla series eventually got, I actually think it was a really smart and necessary decision to make this a direct sequel to the original and ignore the events of all the Godzilla films in between. Directed by Koji Ashimoto, I probably butchered his name, The Return of Godzilla, I think, is definitely one of the best and one of the most underrated Godzilla movies, but I also think this is probably the closest to the original in terms of tone and in terms of what the film is trying to say. Now, much like what happened with the original Godzilla, in 1985, American film company New World Pictures acquired the rights to this movie, and they re-edited the film and dubbed it over in English, and added new scenes featuring the character of Steve Martin, once again played by Raymond Burr, from the Americanized version of the original film, and they re-released it in America under the title Godzilla 1985. Now, I want to talk about the Japanese version first, and then we'll talk about the Americanized version. So, before I really get on to my opinions of The Return of Godzilla, what is your opinions of this movie?
Well, it's funny. I remember I was, I guess, maybe like in the 5th or 6th grade, I guess, when Godzilla 1985 came out. And I had no idea, obviously, that there was a Japanese version. I thought there was only one version of this. So I remember seeing this film. It was released theatrically, I believe, but I didn't see it theatrically. I saw it on cable TV on one of the movie channels. And, at the time, and I guess we'll talk about this when we talk about the American version. I don't want to jump ahead of that. But I remember just being kind of surprised at the tone of the film, having grown up more on the late 60s, 70s Godzilla films. It's only been recently, actually, that I've actually watched the Japanese version of Godzilla, The Return of Godzilla. And what really struck me was like how well done the film was, how serious the film was, and the important political points it was making, especially for its time. Being at the sort of height of the Cold War.
Oh, yeah.
The political points it made, the Japanese one at least, I was quite taken aback by that because I had only seen the American version, which has a very different political agenda than the original Japanese one.
We'll get to that one.
Sure.
But yeah, no, I think the same way that the original Godzilla was really making a commentary on not just the Lucky Dragon incident, but the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this film is really making a commentary on the growing tensions. I mean, these tensions have been going on since the late 1940s, but the tensions between the US and the Soviet Union going on at this time. Now, keep in mind, I was born in 1992, so I was born after the Cold War ended, so you could probably speak to this a lot more than I can, but it seems like in the 1980s, it wasn't a matter of if we get into nuclear war with Russia, it was a matter of when. It seems like a lot of people had this mentality that it was inevitable.
I think that Ronald Reagan actually was quoted as saying this could be the generation that sees, Armageddon and things like that. So the rhetoric was really, really was intense during this time. You had a lot of the return of like duck and cover drills. The fallout shelters were becoming important again to people. So you had this real dread hanging over, and this was in the early 80s, just when this film obviously was being made.
Yeah, and I think this film brilliantly reflects that feeling of dread, and it's funny because, like, a lot of the Cold War movies that I know are films from America at the time, and obviously in America people were terrified of this idea, as I'm sure people in Russia were terrified of this idea of there actually being a conflict between the two superpowers, but I'm sure Japan especially, who was sort of in between this, I'm sure they especially didn't want a conflict because they knew firsthand what nuclear weapons was like and what the damage these things could do to people was.
Absolutely. I think they're the only country that ever had nuclear weapons used against it. So I think, and especially that the fact that they were close to China, close to the Soviet Union, and so absolutely stuck in between all these sort of warring powers, and I think there's a sort of a sense of helplessness that is also felt in the film as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's also, one thing I really, really appreciate about this film is it doesn't single out America or Russia. Rather, it calls them both out. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it also doesn't paint either side as being evil. It's more like, hey, we're all human beings here, let's work together, and I think that's the ultimate message of the film, and it's really just saying, once again, it's not calling out the United States or Russia, it's more saying, both you guys are being freaking stupid here.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I think that's really what we see in this film, more so than the original Godzilla, is that in the original Godzilla, I think Japan is portrayed as not so much a victim, but like that Japan is sort of powerless, okay? And then in the Return of Godzilla, it's almost as Japan is saying, listen, we could be the one that brings things together. We're not powerless anymore. We might not have military power. We might not have the sort of nuclear power to do this, but we know something, we could be the one that brokers this, that we could be the one that sort of brings people together. So I think there's a strength that comes out of that you don't see so much in the original Godzilla, where in Return of Godzilla, you get this idea that, Japan has rebuilt itself, and it's learned the lessons of the past. It can sort of help to sort of prevent those mistakes from being made again. And I think it's an interesting place of power to come from, an empowerment that you see in Return of Godzilla that maybe Japan wasn't ready to have when the original Godzilla came out.
One thing I actually really appreciate about this film is I like how one of the main characters is, like, supposed to be the Prime Minister of Japan. Like, you don't normally see that in a Godzilla movie where a politician is legitimately a main character in the film. And of course, he's more of a side character, but he's still a character that you focus on throughout a lot of the film. And I really liked that, and they made him a genuinely pretty likable character. I also really liked how when he finds out that Godzilla has returned, he says something that I'm sure a lot of politicians can relate to. Even though I personally don't know what's wrong with you if you want to become a politician, but he says, I was hoping I could finish my term peacefully. Mm-hmm. And one scene that I really, really loved is a scene where he's talking to a U.S. ambassador and a Russian ambassador. They're both saying we should use nuclear weapons on Godzilla, and he says, no, We're not doing this. We're not using nuclear weapons. And both the Russian ambassador and then the American ambassador criticized the Prime Minister of Japan for this. And the American ambassador is like, this is no time to be discussing principles. And he says this really powerful line where he's like, this is the exact time to be discussing principles. And he makes a really powerful point, I think, where he says, if Godzilla were attacking Moscow, or if Godzilla were attacking Washington, D.C., would you use nuclear weapons when you know so many of your citizens could be killed?
Absolutely. And that's what I mean. I think that the original Godzilla was coming from a place of great emotional trauma and very sort of about pain and tragedy, whereas Return of Godzilla comes from a more sort of reasoned perspective. That here's Japan, who has had time to really think about these things and to sort of heal those traumas, and that they can speak from a place of experience that the United States and Russia cannot speak from. So that gives Japan, and the Prime Minister specifically in this film, gives them that empowerment, gives them that place of being able to, okay, United States and Soviet Union were the two most powerful nations. Obviously, Japan is not even close to being as powerful as these two nations are or were. But the one thing they can speak from is experience in terms of nuclear war. Yes. And that's one of the things that the Prime Minister does not. Even though in the face of having to sort of appease these two huge nations, the Prime Minister is not going to back down from that. That's the one thing that Japan can talk about in terms that no other country in the world can talk about is what are the consequences of nuclear war? What is the trauma? What is the sort of the tragedy of using those kind of weapons? Japan can speak to that. And that's one of the things I like about the Prime Minister as well. He owns that in the film. He doesn't kowtow to either country.
What do you think of some of the other characters?
I think the characters here are really, really well drawn, well acted. You really believe they're very realistic characters. I think they did a really amazing job with this film. They really did. Which is, and then I guess when we talk about the American version, it's a shame the way the sort of the American version kind of cut some of that out, or doesn't really sort of allow those characters to really shine in a way that the Japanese version does.
And I feel like there is an arc with the main character who's a journalist, because he comes off as a little bit more of a sleazy kind of journalist in the beginning, when he reunites the sister with her brother, who she was told was still missing, but the government was trying to keep it a secret from her because her brother survived the first Godzilla attack that you see happen in this movie. And the main character, the journalist, reunites them, but then he gets his photographer to come into that hospital room, take the pictures, and you get the idea he only wanted to do it so he can get that story. So the film almost seems to be making a subtle commentary on sleazy journalism, but you see him go through a real arc throughout the film and become a better character, I think, as time goes on.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree.
And once again, going back to that feeling of dread, in the continuity of this film, this is the first time Godzilla has shown up in 30 years, and you get that real sense of, we don't want to deal with this again. This was such a horrifying thing to happen to Japan 30 years ago. We don't want this to happen again, but here it is happening again. And even like some of the people's reactions to Godzilla, I think are very realistic in terms of how a person would react if a giant monster was right in front of them. Like, there's that one scene where Godzilla shows up at that nuclear power plant. That guy is pretty much right in front of Godzilla, and he's freaking out. And I feel like that's realistic, because I know I wouldn't be a functional human being if I was right in front of a creature like Godzilla.
Right. And I think that's something that got really lost. And one of the real things that got lost in the 70s Godzilla films was that feeling of awe, that feeling of horror, where, you have even in the late 70s movies, you have like children being like, oh, okay, cool. Godzilla's here, there's monsters here, okay, everything's okay. But I think that that's something that really that really sets this film apart from so many of the other Godzilla films, is that feeling of awe and that feeling of fear and that feeling of horror over being in the presence of these of creatures that we can't understand, that we're so sort of minuscule against.
And I remember when we talked about the original Godzilla, we talked about how you could compare the original Godzilla to a film like On the Beach or something. I feel like with this film, you could very much compare it to films like The Day After or Miracle Mile or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Films that really reflect the anxieties of the possibility of nuclear war.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Also, too, I think that you could compare it to a film like The China Syndrome, Silkwood, movies about nuclear power. Because I think that, obviously when the original Godzilla film was made, you didn't have nuclear power plants and reactors. Whereas when the film was made in the early 80s, nuclear power, that was another big issue. That kind of, well, I guess since the tsunami in Japan, that's really sort of come back, Fukushima and what has happened there. But in the United States at the time, there was a real question of, should we be using nuclear power? What were the consequences of nuclear power plants like 3 Mile Island and things like that, in England Sellafield and things like that going on. So you had that also added in as well, that I think people might not sort of, especially younger viewers might not remember that, but that the question of, was nuclear power a safe alternative? Which I guess they deemed later on was not, since, it's sort of definitely, I think, especially in the United States, maybe in Europe, it's still being used, but in the United States, it definitely sort of has dropped off.
Yeah. And also, I think this is an extremely well-made film. I would honestly say some of the special effects in this film still kind of hold up today. Mm-hmm. Some of them maybe are a little, I hate using the term dated, but some of them maybe could count as a little dated, but I think a lot of them still hold up today.
Absolutely. Actually, one of the things I remember as a child seeing this that was horrifying to me was the trilobites or those sea bugs or whatever.
It was a sea louse.
There's
a sea louse that attacks the fishing boat in the beginning. Yeah. And it's supposed to be like a sea louse that was feeding off Godzilla and the radiation mutated it, which I thought that was really interesting to touch on because Godzilla is supposed to be radioactive. How are like little parasites affected by...
Absolutely.
I thought that was a really interesting idea, which maybe they borrowed a little bit for Cloverfield.
That's what I thought too. The parasites on the monster in Cloverfield. Yeah, absolutely. But I remember seeing that. I was like, it was unexpected. Like seeing a movie where you think Godzilla's going to be the main monster, and all of a sudden to see it was done really well. It was actually done really well.
Now, my only criticism of this film is it's not really the film itself, but the whole film has this really dark and somber tone, very much like the original, but it ends with this really cheesy Japanese pop song that's like, that kind of killed the tone of the whole movie.
Yeah, but I think that was more of a case of the Japanese film industry at the time. Like I've seen other Japanese films and like that, but it seems to be this sentimentality that Japanese films really love to sort of to transmit in some ways. So I can sort of forgive that, knowing that that's sort of what the style of Japanese films at that time, were. But I think the film is excellent. It's an excellent film. Again, it's one of those films where I think that you could put with the original Godzilla in the sense that Godzilla is more of a metaphor in this film than an actual character, which I think is great, which I think is, really you didn't see until maybe in the Millennium series that you saw, with GMK, where Godzilla became a metaphor for, different themes, political, social, themes, and the film does a really good job of that. It never sort of backs off of those important issues.
Now let's talk about the Americanized version of The Return of Godzilla, Godzilla 1985. Now, I know you said you haven't seen this since you were a little kid, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, this does have problems, mainly in kind of how jingoistic it is, but we'll get to that. But I really love this movie, though. I have a lot of nostalgia for this film. This was the second Godzilla film I ever saw. My grandparents, for some reason, had both this and King Kong vs. Godzilla on VHS, so I remember every time I was over their house, I would watch this and King Kong vs. Godzilla. So, for me, King Kong vs. Godzilla and this one were almost like, for a while, were almost like the two definitive Godzilla movies for me, and I really, really enjoy this one despite its flaws, because the film is sort of a bastardized version of the Return of Godzilla. At the same time, though, I do find myself going back and watching this one more than the original edit, even though the original edit of the film is a superior version. I don't know, it's nostalgia for me. Nostalgia is a very powerful emotion, and the nostalgia for this film just causes me to always go back to this one. But also, I think what really elevates this film is honestly Raymond Burr's performance in it, because when Raymond Burr comes back in this movie, and of course he's only in the scenes that were added for this version of the film, he really does elevate the material, I think, because one thing that New World Pictures wanted to do was they wanted to take the original Japanese cut of this movie and make it a straight-out comedy. And Raymond Burr actually, because they wanted Raymond Burr to come back to reprise his role as Steve Martin, and he was like, no, I won't do this if you're going to make this a comedy. He wanted it to be taken seriously, and to a certain extent, though, you could kind of tell he doesn't really want to be there. At the same time, though, the fact that he wanted them to take this material seriously, I will forever have respect for Raymond Burr. Like, I know he's dead now, but if he were still alive, he could come to my house and kill my cat for all I care. I will still have respect for this man because of that.
No, absolutely, I agree. I think he brought a tremendous amount of pathos to the film, and that important connection to the original. Because I think for so many people, Godzilla films, especially in America, Godzilla films had become comedies or things to be ridiculed. So his presence in the film really harkens back to that original Godzilla. And really harkens back to the roots of Godzilla as being a powerful metaphor for destruction and chaos and nuclear war and man's capacity for destruction. So he was a very important part of this, and I agree. I think without him, the American version wouldn't even be worth discussing outside of maybe nostalgia value.
Because besides him, he's kind of the only American actor who shows up in this movie who actually takes it seriously. Because, like, you have this one soldier or sergeant this guy with red hair who's always drinking Dr. Pepper in the movie, because there was a lot of Dr. Pepper product placement in the Americanized version of this. But he's making all these wise-ass comments when they're watching footage of what Godzilla's doing in Tokyo. Like, when Godzilla's destroying Tokyo, he goes, that's quite an urban renewal program they got going on there. And you even see Steve Martin, Raymond Burr's character, just go shake his head like, are you fucking kidding me? You're making a joke like that? Raymond Burr is really the only actor who's 100% taking it seriously. And I think a lot of the humor that's introduced to the American cut is a leftover from the fact that they originally wanted to make this a straight comedy.
Mm-hmm. I also think, too, I'm thinking about the audience that the American version was geared towards. I really think they were trying to gear it towards teenagers and kids, so I think that comedy, they thought in some ways would make it more appealing, because the film is a very dark tone, especially if you're trying to sort of market this to kids and to teenagers, Because I remember when I saw the film, I was like, as a kid, I was kind of disappointed because I expected like a monster rally. I expected like seeing like, a Godzilla's Revenge or Godzilla vs. Megalon, But once I got into the film, I liked it. I think after the initial understanding that, okay, this was not going to be like the Godzilla films I had seen previous to this, once I sort of accepted that and got into it, then I enjoyed it tremendously. But I think the initial shock that this was going to be a serious movie was kind of hard for me as a kid to understand.
And I think, honestly, this is one of the Godzilla movies that showed me that Godzilla can be taken seriously. Even as a little kid, I started to notice that. Mm-hmm. And now this one actually didn't do too well in America. And I think a lot of that was because American audiences were more used to the 70s Godzilla films, and a lot of people were disappointed that this one wasn't fun.
No, absolutely. And being a part of that demographic at the time, yeah, I would say that's probably true. But like I said, I think once I got into the film, I enjoyed it. But I think initially I was like, why, where's Godzilla? Where's the other monsters? Why aren't they fighting? Where's all these people talking? What's going on here? But again, I think it's because the production company must have, geared this to and marketed this to children and to teenagers, when it really is a much more mature adult story.
Yeah. And one thing that I think this movie has above the Japanese version, even though, as we discussed, the Japanese version is far superior, Raymond Burr at the end of this movie, when Godzilla's fallen into the volcano, has this great philosophical speech about the nature of Godzilla and the nature of man's conflicts with nature that I hold as one of the great movie speeches of all time. And that's what he says right before the ending credits, and to me that works so much better than the Japanese pop song that's at the end of the Japanese version. So once again, even though the Japanese version is much better, this one at least has that ending speech that I think really adds something to the themes of not just this film, but also the themes of the original Godzilla.
I'll have to watch it again because I don't. Being a kid, I probably ignored that. I probably ignored the speech when I was a kid, but I'm curious to hear it again.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Japanese version is now available on DVD, but this version, Godzilla 1985, is only available on VHS, which I guess for rights reasons they haven't been able to release it on DVD yet, but like I would totally let you borrow the movie, but I only have it on VHS, and I know you don't have a VCR anymore.
Yeah, not anymore, yeah.
But I could see something like, if they could get the rights, I could see Shout Factory put this movie out.
That'd be great to do, like, even as a twofer.
Yeah.
Both cuts on it,
Now, here's my biggest issue with this movie, is how jingoistic it is. Because in the original Japanese cut of the movie, there's a scene where the Russians accidentally launch a nuclear missile at Godzilla, and then they try to stop it, but in the Japanese cut, you actually see the Russian character try to stop this nuclear missile from being launched, because he realizes that so many lives will be destroyed. In the American edit, they make it look like this Russian character intentionally launched the missile.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably the biggest issue, is the American cut very much paints the Russians as the bad guys, as the villains. At the same time, it's not really surprising, considering this movie came out around the same time as movies like Red Dawn and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think even as a kid, being like, the bad guys in this movie is not just Godzilla, but the Russians are the bad guys too in the film, But again, it makes sense in terms of the socio-political landscape when this film came out in America. Obviously, you had that sort of that sentiment.
But it's just, I don't know, it's weird because like the Japanese version of this is all about cooperation. This just comes off as being almost propagandist.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree, totally.
So, we pretty much covered our thoughts on the Return of Godzilla / Godzilla 1985. Now, in 1989, Toho ended up releasing a sequel to the Return of Godzilla or Godzilla 1985, depending on which version you want to hold as the definitive version of that movie. And that was Godzilla vs. Biollante, which I think is one of the most unique Godzilla films ever made. But what do you think of this movie?
I agree. I think it has a lot of good ideas. I don't know if they all work. I think it's maybe there's too much in the film. There's too much going on in the film. But I love the look of the film. I think the monster is really, really very creative. And I think it is. It's one of the most unique, interesting Godzilla films. And what's funny about it was that I didn't even know about it. It was one of those things where, I think when it came out was in the very early days of the internet, so getting coverage of Japanese films was hard unless you bought magazines and you kept up with fanzines, So I didn't even know about this film. I thought the first one this was a little bit later on, but that Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the second sequel was actually the first one, So I actually had to catch up with this one later on once I started reading up and found out. I didn't even know that they were doing a series of Godzilla films. Once I found that out and sort of read up on it, that's when I was able to catch up on it. I think I first saw this on a bootleg because I don't think this was even available on tape or whatever at the time. But yeah, I was like very pleasantly surprised about how innovative the film was. But again, I don't think everything works in the film either. But for a Godzilla movie, I was like, wow, Toho really stepped it up for this film.
I think what I appreciate most about this film is it has a premise which, if handled the wrong way, could have been the stupidest movie in the world. Because essentially, the film's about a scientist who combines Godzilla's DNA with that of a rose's DNA, but it turns out the rose is also possessed by the spirit of his dead daughter, and you have a psychic girl in the movie who would end up becoming a reoccurring character throughout the Heisei Godzilla films. And the premise, it could have been the stupidest premise in the world, but I think it's handled pretty well in the film, honestly. And it succeeds at being a pretty dark movie, at the same time having, which, if handled the wrong way, could have been a really cheesy premise.
Right. I also think it's a beautiful film, too. I mean, the imagery in the film and some of the shots in the film of the different plant life and the different, things going on in the film. It's a beautiful, just a very visually striking film.
I also like how this one is very mystical in the way it feels. Like, it's focuses on more of the mystical aspect of the Godzilla mythos. Like, it deals with spirituality, and you have, once again, Biollante is supposed to be possessed by the ghost of this guy's daughter, so it deals with a lot of these ideas of spirituality, of mysticism, of psychic phenomenon. It's really weird, and I almost see an anime influence on this movie in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Well, I heard that the character, the psychic character, was based on a manga character or an anime character, Mai, the psychic girl, something like that.
Okay.
And I heard that was the influence from there. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about sort of fantastique films, in Japan at the time, you cannot sort of disregard the influence of anime, right? Anime was huge. But the film, like I said, I think that there's a lot of ideas in the film. I don't know if they work through all the ideas that well. Some ideas work better in this film than other ones do. I feel that sometimes it's like, I don't know if maybe it's because of the American subtitles or whatever, is that some of the things I was kind of confused by. Like, I wasn't quite sure what was going on in parts of the film. But like I said, in terms of its ambition, the film is amazing, and it's in terms of what it wanted to accomplish and what it wanted to encompass in terms of a Godzilla film.
And I think Biollante is one of the most unique monsters from any of the Godzilla films. Mm-hmm. And I like how it goes through different stages. At first it appears like a giant monster rose, and then it appears as something more reptilian later on. Mm-hmm. And once again, it's such a weird movie, but for me it works. It really does. And I almost wanted to make a comparison between this and a movie like Akira or something, because both films kind of deal with psychic phenomenon, I mean, in different ways, and they're both very different films, but I almost feel like you could almost make a comparison between this and Akira, like maybe, because Akira was such a big movie and such an influential film that maybe this was taking some inspiration from Akira in some ways.
Yeah, I also think in terms of the imagery. I mean, in Akira, you had some really kind of surrealistic, kind of like flesh, like biomechanical kind of crossover. In this movie, not so much biomechanical, but more like vegetable flesh kind of mutations, I guess. Maybe mutation would be the best like way of saying, or hybridization. And you see that in Akira, but I think you also see that in this film too.
Yeah, and I actually, before I ever saw this movie, I had a toy of Biollante, because when I was a little kid, my parents and my family members were always giving me Godzilla toys, and I remember when I was like, I had to be like 3 years old, I got a little toy of Biollante, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, and I still have that toy too. It's one of the few Godzilla toys I actually kept. I honestly wish I kept more of them, because those are probably worth money now, but yeah, once again, I think this is a really, really good Godzilla movie. I agree with you to a certain extent that maybe some of the ideas don't work as much as they could, but I think for the most part it works. Like, I think for the most part it manages to take this rather ludicrous premise and actually make it kind of believable in context of this universe. And I also think it's a great follow-up to Godzilla 1985 and really does reference the events from that movie too.
No, absolutely. And like I said, one of the things I like about the Heisei films is that they're even though maybe if they're sort of the ambition is beyond their ability to actually pay off on it, but it's great that these films have such high ambition, like what they're trying to achieve, or the ideas that they introduce into the films. That's great. I mean, that's really creative, and that's what makes a great, fantastic film, is to have those sort of ideas and that ambition and that creativity. And I think these films have that in spades.
Now let's move on to Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the third film of the Heisei Godzilla series. This is one that I do like a lot. At the same time, I feel like a lot of Godzilla fans kind of overpraise this one, because I do have a lot of issues with this film. I think this film has plot holes beyond anything I've ever seen before, but what are your opinions?
Well, I love this film because I think, going back to nostalgia, this is the film that sort of reintroduced me to Godzilla. Like, I did not know, I knew about Godzilla in 1985, obviously, but then after that, I had no... Again, this is pre-internet, where sort of news about these things was hard to come by unless you were really tied into the fandom at the time. So to realize that there was a new Godzilla film that actually was had action in it and was actually looked really great and had some really interesting ideas and was ambitious. I was like, holy cow, this is great. This is something that I've been waiting for. So that's why I love this film. It sort of reintroduced me, sort of re-energized my love for Godzilla.
Okay. I mean, the film does have an interesting premise, the whole time travel premise, but I feel like there's a lot of plot holes attached to that too. Okay, so they go back in time, they erase Godzilla from existence, and replace him, the bad guys replace him with King Ghidorah. The issue is, people still remember Godzilla somehow, and then in the Godzilla films that came after this, they still referenced the events from the Return of Godzilla, and then the events from the original Godzilla, and it's wait a minute, shouldn't those have been erased from existence? Now, of course, I've always came up with my own fan theories, maybe the timeline fixed itself, but to me, there's just so many plot holes in this and I still love the film, don't get me wrong, I love the film, but I do have a lot of issues with the plot holes in the film.
Yeah, I can see that. But most time travel movies, though, if you think about it, you could pick apart pretty much all the time travel movies. So I totally understand what you're saying with that, but I have a tendency to sort of, if I like something, of course you're going to ignore it. If you don't like it, then you're going to sort of, you're going to have to, latch onto it, But like I said, I thought it was really, really innovative. I loved the approach to the film. It sort of really, to me, updated Godzilla into the 90s at the time. I mean, really updated it. It was no longer this idea that it was a relic of the 70s or the 50s or the 60s. It wasn't a relic of those things. It was now it was modern, what I mean? It was contemporary. And that was one of the things that I really, that I enjoyed about it, was that it really made it sort of more contemporary. It didn't feel like it was a nostalgia act. It was no, this was something that was vital, new, and could still say something really important and be entertaining, rather than just something that was something from, my childhood.
Yeah. And also, I do like how they incorporated King Ghidorah into this, and obviously, since the Heisei films are a completely different continuity than the Showa films, they changed King Ghidorah's origin, whereas in the original series, Ghidorah was an alien. In this, Ghidorah is actually a creature created by the villains of the film, who take these, three little bat-like creatures and then put him on the island that would eventually be affected by the Bikini Atoll test of 1954, and you're supposed to assume that those three little creatures merged together and were mutated into King Ghidorah. I thought that was an interesting new origin for King Ghidorah, and also I felt like King Ghidorah's look in this movie, he looked very much like he did in the Showa films, but they altered the heads a little bit, and I also loved Mega King Ghidorah,
yeah, he looks awesome.
Mecha King Ghidorah. That was a really interesting idea, and that's another thing. I had a toy of Mecha King Ghidorah before I ever saw this movie. But yeah, I do think it's a good Godzilla film. I just have some minor issues with it, though.
I also think that one of the only things that I think, to me, that was kind of, I guess it was, by trying to sort of update it, they had to in some ways sort of copy. But I think this is where you start getting in the Godzilla films, where you start getting sort of borrowing from other contemporary films.
Oh, this is very Terminator.
Right, exactly. And
even
you see that with the other ones.
Even the little creatures that eventually become King Ghidorah is so reminiscent of Gremlins.
Yeah.
Okay, the Mogwais are these cute little creatures, but they turn into these ugly-ass monsters. It's kind of the same principle with this.
Yeah, that's true.
And also, this one, was actually kind of controversial in America because of. In the film, there's a scene where they go back in time to World War II, and you see that Japanese general, like, giving a speech to his men about how we'll beat the Americans, and in America that was very controversial, but I'm just thinking, it's a Japanese film. It's like, how many films about World War II coming out in America are about, are kind of anti-Japanese at that time, so it's like, I don't really have a problem with it, because that's what a Japanese general would have been saying to his men during the Second World War, so...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the film is it's very patriotic for Japanese people, like... In the film, you find out that apparently in the future, Japan will become, like, the biggest superpower on the planet, pretty much, and that's kind of what the villains are trying to prevent. So it is a very, I don't want to say jingoistic, but definitely very patriotic for Japan.
Right, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And again, it's interesting. It's why not have an ambitious film like that? Like, to imagine Japan. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Again, it just shows the insecurity, of some people. But anyways, I think it works really well, and like I said, it was really the film that really sort of reignited my love of Godzilla.
Yeah. And it also brought back the sidekick character from Godzilla vs. Biollante. The character's name is Mickey. I can't pronounce her last name, but I thought that was interesting how this series really did have a more heavy emphasis on continuity than the Showa films, even though even the continuity in this series is a little skewed at some points. But yeah, it's a good Godzilla film. And now let's move on to the fourth film of the Heisei Godzilla series, Godzilla and Mothra, The Battle for Earth. Well, technically, I think the original title was Godzilla vs. Mothra, but in America, it's known as Godzilla and Mothra, The Battle for Earth, and this is one, it's a remake, it's a loose remake of the original Godzilla vs. Mothra, as well as a loose remake of the original Mothra movie. What are your opinions of this?
Oh, I like this one tremendously, too. I thought this was a great one, too. It's, I think, probably my two favorite of the Heisei series. I think it's, again, another film that sort of balances, it's very entertaining. There's a lot of scenes with the monsters. There's a lot of scenes of battle. But also, I mean, it has an environmental consciousness to the film. There's still important points to be made about, human beings, sort of abuse of the environment and the commercialism of the sort of business versus environmental sort of protection. So again, it's a film that I enjoyed immensely. That's another one of my favorites.
This is actually my least favorite of the Heisei films. I don't hate this one, but at the same time, I don't know, the message of the film is just, for me, a little too preachy. Like, obviously it's a good message, because we should be taking better care of our environment. At the same time, there's doing that message right, and then there's doing it where it's like Captain Planet almost, where it's like kind of shoving it in your face, and I felt like this film was kind of just shoving it in my face.
Well, you gotta remember the sort of the context of the film coming out was that was the real first. Obviously the environmental movement had begun like in the 1960s and things like that, but by the 90s, it had actually become an important issue. You know what I mean? So I think that's where that's coming from too. Is this idea that okay, now this is something that is on everybody's radar, not just on the environmentalist radar, but it needs to be a sort of a global issue. So I think that's where that's coming from.
And I did appreciate, I love Batra, the demon version of Mothra. I thought he was a really interesting kaiju. And I also really do like the special effects in this movie. Like, Mothra in the film very much looks like she did in the Showa films, but slightly updated for the 90s. But I think the effects in this film are breathtaking. Like, they still very, very much hold up, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, once again, I'm not the biggest fan of this one, but I appreciate it for the most part. And I actually want to point out that this was the highest, I think this was, at the time, the highest grossing Godzilla film. And actually in Japan, because this came out at like the tail end of 1992 in Japan, and so a lot of its box office success, I think, was in 93, and apparently in 1993, this and Jurassic Park were like the two highest grossing films in Japan at the time.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And this movie also kind of spawned its own spin-off series called the Rebirth of Mothra films, which I actually don't even think are in continuity with this film.
I've heard of them, but I've actually never seen them.
Another issue I have, and this isn't really the movie's fault, but I have all these Heisei Godzilla films on these VHS tapes that Columbia Pictures released like shortly after the first American Godzilla film came out, and the dubbing on them is really, really bad. And I think I have a bit of a bias towards this film because I've only seen the dubbed version, which is horrendous.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why I don't like it as much as you might.
You could be, yeah.
But it's not I don't hate it, but it's my least favorite of the Heisei Godzilla films. And now let's move on to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, which was essentially a loose remake of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. And I really enjoy this one. I think this is a really, really fun Godzilla film. But what do you think of this one?
I enjoy it too. I think it's interesting. I think because Godzilla vs. Mothra was a more sort of feminine, more sort of environmental, more organic film, that they answered with this film, which is really like about metal and about like technology and about steel and but it's great. It's a really good movie. I don't like it as much as I like the two previous films, but I still enjoy the film.
Okay. Also, I like how they changed Mechagodzilla's origin, because in the original series he was created by aliens. In this, he's actually a robot created by the Japanese government to defend the nation against Godzilla. I thought that was really cool. I liked how they brought back Rodan in this movie. And also, this movie has a strange variation on Minya, because there's a baby Godzilla that shows up in this movie, and obviously it's supposed to be based on Minya, and this baby Godzilla comes back in the next two Godzilla films that came after it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the look of Mechagodzilla? Because to be honest, like, this is my least favorite look. Like, I love the original look, and then I love the millennial look. This one, I know, is kind of boring to me. It's like too sheer. It's like too minimal. I don't know. What do you think?
I actually really liked Mechagodzilla's look in this. I love the look for Mechagodzilla in the original series. To me, that's my favorite look for Mechagodzilla, but honestly, my least favorite look for Mechagodzilla is the Millennial series. This is actually my second favorite look for Mechagodzilla. I thought he looked really cool in this. And this one also incorporates some mystical ideas in it too, like there's a certain point where they get this plant from an island that was irradiated by nuclear test, and they end up putting it in a CD recorder, and there's like child voices coming out of it. So this one has like sort of a mystical idea to it. Even like at the end where, because they basically end up killing Godzilla at the end, but then Rodan turns into dust, and then it gets absorbed into Godzilla, and that's what brings Godzilla back to life at the end. So this one, sort of like Godzilla vs. Biollante, incorporates like the mystical aspects of the Godzilla mythos into it.
Yeah, it's good. It's like I said, it's again, it's like it's an ambitious film. That's what I love about these films. It's you see this, I think, in with a lot of Japanese films like this, is that they don't look at it like, oh, this is a monster movie, let's dumb it down, let's play it safe, let's do things that are very basic. And their films are like, no, let's shoot the moon. Let's like have like robots, and let's have like Rodan, and let's have mystical, you know what I mean? Like they really, and that's what I really enjoy about these films, is the ambition of the film, the sort of this idea that we're going to strive, we're going to try to sort of put as many great, interesting ideas into a film as possible. Maybe they don't all work out, maybe they're not all sort of logical, maybe they're not all explained. Who cares? It's going to make it an exciting, interesting film.
Now, the one thing I don't like about this movie, now in the film they bring back the sidekick girl Mickey from the previous Godzilla films, and she ends up being one of the people operating Mechagodzilla in this, but this is where she starts to kind of grow feelings for Godzilla, where she like starts to become against them killing Godzilla, which I loved the character in the previous Godzilla films, but this is the beginning of them kind of making the character, I hate to say it, in the next film especially, they make her kind of a whiny bitch, pretty much, which we'll get to that with. Actually, let's get to that with Godzilla versus Space Godzilla. Mm-hmm. Now, I have a lot of nostalgia for this one, and this is considered to be the worst of the Heisei Godzilla films. But I have a soft spot for this movie. It's not a great movie, but I do really enjoy it, though.
Right. It's actually my least favorite out of the ones. I think this is one of the ones where the ambition sort of just falls apart in the film. I think that this is the film where they kind of, although there's some interesting ideas in the film, it's not as interesting to me. I think they kind of like sort of rested on their laurels a little bit with this film. I mean, I love the look of Space Godzilla. I know like some people sort of attacked that and said it was like, but the look I think in the film is great.
Space Godzilla, he's one of my favorite kaijus.
Right, the look is amazing with like the crystals on his shoulders and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the story to me was kind of not as interesting, not as creative as maybe the other ones. So, but I guess after making like a bunch of really great films in a row, I mean, there's got to be some drop off, I suppose.
Yeah. One thing I did appreciate about this one is this one has a direct tie-in with Godzilla vs. Biollante, because in the film there's a character who wants to get revenge on Godzilla because his best friend was killed by Godzilla, and his best friend was actually a character that you saw get killed in Godzilla vs. Biollante. So that is something I really like about the Heisei films, is this emphasis on continuity, where you have a character from Godzilla vs. Biollante, or you have a character who knew a character from Godzilla vs. Biollante coming into play in this movie. And also, it's implied that Space Godzilla was created because of when Biollante went into space. Since Biollante was made from Godzilla's DNA, some of Godzilla's DNA got into space and mutated into Space Godzilla. But it's also implied that maybe when Mothra went into space in Godzilla and Mothra, that's also how Space Godzilla was born. But also, the biggest, and this is my issue with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, is the tie-ins to Godzilla vs. Biollante shouldn't make sense, because technically Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was supposed to erase all that from existence. So there are plot holes, but I still enjoy this one myself. Mm-hmm. I like the robot they have in the movie, Megara, or Magra. How do you pronounce it? Megara, yeah. Who I know was in The
Mysterians?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
I thought that was an interesting mecha.
See, I like that mecha better than Mechagodzilla in the previous film.
Okay.
Like, I thought that was really cool robot, and it did some really cool things, so I like that one better.
Now, there is an interesting plot point in this movie that I don't think really comes to fruition, where you find out that the Japanese mafia, because in the film there are attempts to control Godzilla, and there's a certain plot point where the Japanese mafia is trying to take control of Godzilla, but nothing really happens with that.
That's strange. Yeah, that was a really strange plot point. I mean, it might have been an interesting avenue to go down, I suppose. But it's kind of that's a good point. I don't know where they were going with that one. It's
like, yeah, we'll have you whacked. We'll have Godzilla whack you. And then my biggest issue with this film is what they do with the character of Mickey. Mm-hmm. I do not like what they did with her in this movie, because in the film, when they're talking about killing Godzilla, she's like, you don't have to kill him. It's like, no, you have to freaking kill this thing. It's like, you can feel bad for Godzilla, because these Heisei films are meant to make you feel sympathy for Godzilla, because it's not the creature's fault it became like this. It's really man's fault it became like this. But you still have to kill it, because keeping this thing alive, there's so much human risk involved. Like, no, you have to kill this thing. So I don't like what they did with her character.
And I wasn't crazy about the baby Godzilla.
Yeah.
Part of the plot either. I think that's when they started getting a little bit too sentimental. And that's when, trying to really make it sort of trying to please a bunch of people, which I think was one of the things that happened. That was the sort of the downfall of the Showa series, was just trying to please too many people in these films, saying, okay, we're going to please, the younger people watching the film, we're gonna throw some stuff in what the older people want to see. We're gonna throw some stuff that the female part of the audience is gonna like. We want to put something. It seems like this is a film that they were like, all right, we're gonna please everybody in the test audience. Like, we're gonna try to we're gonna cover all our bases, and maybe it's because the other films had been so popular, and they wanted to keep that up, and they wanted to make sure that it stayed to be a money making enterprise. But it just seems to me, it's just like this, just when you try to please everybody in a film, you end up pleasing no one. It all becomes mediocre, and I think that's what this film to me is. It's a very mediocre film.
Okay.
And again, it's this idea that, okay, we're gonna sort of try to appeal, and this could be product. This could be that they wanted to sell Baby Godzilla toys, so they're gonna put this in there to get kids to buy toys. So again, it's hard to sort of, I guess it's hard to parse out like what was sort of artistic choices and what were sort of like business choices in terms of the film.
Yeah. But I still enjoy it. I mean, I once again, it's not my least favorite of the series. My least favorite is the Mothra one, but I get why people don't like this one. I would say, technically and storytelling-wise, this is the weakest of the Heisei series. But now let's move on to the final Heisei Godzilla film, Godzilla vs. Destroyer, which I don't like as much as the Return of Godzilla or Godzilla vs. Biollante. But this is a damn good one. Mm-hmm. And a really good, because this was meant to be the final Godzilla film, and I think this is a damn good bookend to the whole series.
Well, I'll tell you, when I first heard that when this movie was announced, and when I first heard that this was going to be the last Godzilla movie, I knew that by doing that, there's no way. How do you cap such an iconic film series? So I had this feeling that it was bound to be sort of not a disappointment so much, but it just was not going to be able to do the series justice. And it's a film that I do enjoy very much, but again, I just think that, I mean, how do you cap something that is so a phenomenon like this, But they give it a good try. I would say they gave it a good try, but I don't know if anybody would be able to cap, to put sort of, the end of such a huge cultural iconic phenomenon, But again, I like, and I really like the way they sort of connect this with the first, yes, Godzilla film, and they really tried to make sort of like a full circle kind of thing going on here.
Yeah, because the character of Emiko from the original film comes back in this. Obviously, she's an old woman now, but one of the main characters is actually supposed to be, I think, her nephew or something. I forgot exactly. And also, the creatures in the film, Destroyer, they were creatures created by Serizawa using the Oxygen Destroyer, which in a lot of ways, that's showing that Serizawa's prophecy came true. Mm-hmm. He was so worried that the Oxygen Destroyer will be destructive, and you see that, it ended up being very destructive. Mm-hmm. And once again, tying it in with the original film really was so appropriate, considering this was meant to be the final film.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like I said, it's an enjoyable film. It's it's entertaining. It's thought provoking. It is. I just like, how do you cap off a phenomenon like that by saying this is going to be the last film in the series, which of course we realize it was not at all. But I think it sets up expectations.
Okay.
That how can you meet those expectations? You couldn't. So me seeing this film, I'm like, okay, where's the big ending? Where's the big where's the time? Ending this on a note where you feel like, wow, I've really sort of experienced something. I don't know if anything could have done that. So I guess that's why in my mind I'm always going to be even though I like the film, I'm always going to be slightly disappointed in the film because my expectation was like, wow, this was going to put the exclamation point at the end or the period at the end or whatever, and it really didn't for me. I remember after watching I was like, okay, it was good, but did it really sort of meet my expectations in terms of what I wanted to see as the sort of culmination of the Godzilla phenomenon,
Yeah. What do you think of Godzilla's look in the movie? Because the whole point is Godzilla is supposed to be melting down, like his heart is a nuclear reactor pretty much, and I really do like the whole red Godzilla in this.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was an awesome idea. That's like a really cool idea, And yeah, absolutely. I mean, the look was cool, and again, like I said, the concept is cool. But again, I don't know if they would have, knowing that this was going to be, at least at the time, was going to be the last Godzilla film. I'm not sure that they could have came up with a concept that would have satisfied me by me saying, yes, okay, this is something that's going to totally sort of put the sort of, end this on a note that I'm saying, yes, I'm glad it's over, it's done, they sort of did the whole story arc. I don't know if there was a concept they'd be able to sort of to sort of achieve that. But the look of the Godzilla in the film is great. The idea that he's going into sort of meltdown, that's a really cool idea. That's very innovative.
Now, before we end this, any closing thoughts on the overall Heisei Godzilla series?
Well, it's one I enjoyed tremendously. I mean, even Space Godzilla, which I is my least favorite of them, I still was very entertaining. And I think this series, I mean, to me, if you look, I mean, obviously the Showa series, there was ups and downs because there were so many of them, and then the Millennial series, which I guess we'll talk about again. To me, the most consistently entertaining and most consistently sort of creative, I would say the Heisei series would be. Out of the three series, I would say to me that is the most one that I felt was the most consistent.
Yeah, and I would say, even though I do think some Godzilla fans kind of overpraise the later Heisei Godzilla films, and while I do think this series had its low points, I will never deny, though, that all the Heisei Godzilla films were just so ambitious. And I think that's the one thing that that you could take from these films is there was so much ambition to these films. So you got to have a lot of respect for these films in that regard.
Absolutely.
Like they were taking the concept of Godzilla seriously. And I think each film, while I think there were points where they were taking it too seriously, because I do think some of these films had some goofy shit in them, you could still tell they had a love and respect for the original Godzilla, and the original Godzilla film still informed all these films.
Absolutely, and they pushed the concept into some really interesting places.
Yeah.
And to me, I'll always be grateful for that because I think it really made me reconsider what Godzilla was. I think before I saw these films, I thought, oh, I know what Godzilla is. I know what he's about. I know these films really made me question that, made me really sort of rethink who Godzilla is, what he could represent, what his impact on the world would be, the consequences on politics and social, relationships and any number of things. So these films were really thought-provoking, and it's great. I mean, it's. I think that's to be able to sort of make a thought-provoking film and an entertaining film at the same time, right? That's like amazing to be able to do that. A lot of times you're lucky if you get one or the other from a film, but to have such a consistent series of films that really was thought-provoking as well as entertaining and exciting and things that you were sort of happy to see, that's rare.
All right. So next time you'll be hearing us talk, we'll be talking about the Millennium Godzilla series. So stay tuned for that, and bye.